Hi everyone, my name is David Fomin, and one of the most unforgettable moments of my life was visiting a Maasai village. The Maasai are a nomadic tribe that live in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. They're one of the most well-known African tribes around the world, but also among the poorest. The village we visited had no electricity. We got a chance to meet the chief. He was wrapped in a traditional Maasai blanket and wore traditional Maasai earrings. He asked me how many wives I had. Turns out the Maasai are polygamous. Believe it or not, that question wasn't the most memorable part of my visit. One of my friends had brought along some candy, and we decided to hand it out to the kids. They were absolutely overjoyed. I will never forget the smiles on their faces and their laughter. Now, of course, we hadn't changed their lives or even helped in any meaningful way, but we had made a tangible difference. We had given them a moment of happiness. Last summer, I traveled to Mombasa, Kenya on a medical internship through a program called International Medical Aid. International Medical Aid is a program that gives pre-med and medical school students the opportunity to shadow in a public hospital, interact with locals, and learn about life in Kenya. Today I want to talk about how my experiences have led me to understand how to answer problems with intangible solutions. As a high school junior, I needed to find something to do over the summer. I had a growing interest in medicine and a desire to see the world, so I decided to apply to IMA. To my surprise, I got in. I spent months eagerly awaiting the day that I would board the plane to Mombasa. My mom spent those months eagerly hoping that I would change my mind. When I finally boarded the plane to Mombasa, I had doubts about whether the program was even real. Thankfully, it was. In Mombasa, we stayed in a hostel in a neighborhood called Nyali. When I first got to the hostel, everyone was talking about frats and sororities and their professors. I quickly realized that I was the only high schooler on a trip of college juniors, seniors, and medical school students. I stayed undercover for a good 7 minutes until someone asked me what college I go to, and I mumbled Mountain View College. I became known as Fetus. After a brief orientation, I was introduced to my roommate, Naz. The first thing Naz told me was that he had seen someone die that day in the hospital, and that our other roommate, Tyler, might have meningitis. I didn't even know what meningitis was. To Naz, I'm sure this conversation seemed pretty routine, but I didn't know how to handle it. I was expected to ping pong from icebreakers to mortality. And so, I did what any 17-year-old would do with my shoes, and I started to panic. To my mom. I told her, I think I'm getting a little scared. I wasn't doing so hot. Thankfully, Tyler didn't have meningitis, which is good, because I'm still not 100% sure as to what it is. I started to settle in. We explored a Portuguese fort in Mombasa and those stunning white sand beaches. Finally, Monday, the first real day of the trip arrived. We were off to Coast General Public Hospital, the second largest government hospital in the entire country and the referral center for the coastal region. My first rotation was in pediatrics. Nurses told us to reuse gloves if they ran out and to take off our shoes going into the ICU because there were no more shoe covers. In socks, I listened to doctors scold medical students for ordering CT scans because of the lack of resources. CT scans that would have been routine in the United States. Doctors were forced to make do with what they had. Most horrifying was that I was seeing the same conditions over and over again. Almost every patient was undernourished. Nurses had trouble putting in lines because the veins were so hard to find. I even saw a doctor attempt to draw blood from a baby's head. And then there was malaria. In the United States, we don't even need to think about malaria, but in Kenya, it kills every day. In the break rooms, instead of talking about what kid had the funniest reason for breaking a leg or whatever doctors talk about, I'm not quite sure, I'm still a few years away from medical school, doctors in Kenya talked about how they might have to go another month without pay after the most recent government budget cuts. Nurses explained to us that hospital officials would pocket allocated government money, and that government officials would pocket some of this money. There was corruption at every level. Unfortunately, the systemic problems didn't stop at corruption or in the hospital. Homosexuality is still a crime in Kenya, warranting a 14-year prison sentence. Kenyan women don't have many of the rights that we consider essential here in the United States, with widespread sexual harassment. Every morning, I would look out the window of the bus and see women walking down the street, catcalled by every passing man. We saw many rape victims in the hospital. And yet, under all of this, there was a degree of happiness like I had never seen before. I got the opportunity to shadow doctors on a night shift in the maternity ward at the hospital. It was a mostly quiet night. We got to see a woman give birth through C-section, a procedure I found immensely interesting. But perhaps the most memorable moment was when a woman gave birth naturally a few hours later. The nurses screamed, "Sukuma," which means push in Swahili. At 3:08 a.m. Eastern African time, a baby boy was born. The pure joy on the new mother's face as she held her son for the very first time is truly indescribable. My experiences opened my eyes to such moments that I will never forget. On the streets, everyone would say hello, ask how are you, and always smile. Kids would run up to me and try to grab my hair and ask why it was so different from theirs. Every time they would see me, they would point at me and yell "Mzungu," which means white person in Swahili. On Sundays, the beach would transform into a series of soccer games spanning the entire beach. However, I won't forget about the challenges that Kenyans face every day. A corrupt government dominates their lives and violates their natural human rights. One of my biggest takeaways from my travels to Kenya is that solving such overwhelmingly large problems is not the only way to help those in need. These societal changes often take financial power and influence that we just don't have access to. They can take years and even decades. And yet, doctors and nurses at Coast General don't have PPE to protect themselves against the infectious diseases like malaria, TB, COVID-19 right now. Change in years is too late. When one of my friends gave her spare masks and gloves to doctors and nurses at the hospital, they were put to use that very same day. Of course, in the grand scheme, this contribution is meaningless. But if it saved lives, is it really meaningless? Kenya is stunning. The sheer natural beauty alone makes Kenya worth visiting. Many of the myths about travel to the developing world are misleading. Risks are minimal with precautions and heavily outweighed. But you don't need to go to Mombasa to make a difference. Even here in the Silicon Valley, one of the wealthiest regions in the world, people face hunger, poverty, sexual harassment. On a societal level, these problems are also very hard to solve. However, that only makes the value of individual contribution even greater. Those suffering feel it in the present, right now. If you participate in food drives, volunteer at shelters, or give financial support to important causes, you will arguably create the most direct impact. Compounded together, our efforts are powerful, even in the face of obscure and intangible societal problems. Together, we can help those in need, right here, right now. Thank you.